Hi everybody. So I'm Megan. I'm a sales and natural resources assistant at Raise and Innovation for Agriculture. And as Tash says, our webinar today will be about diversified rotations on farm. So this is a really pressing topic at the moment. We wanted to do a webinar on it because it sort of spans across all the projects we do, whether it's looking at financial resilience, or resilience against pests, climate change, things like that. With all the changing economic, political, climatic context on farm at the moment, diversifying your rotation can be one of the first steps to building a resilience at all levels of the farm business. So we're going to start with Josiah. Josiah Meldrum is the co-founder and director of Hodmedod's, who work closely with farmers to produce a great diversity of crops and importantly support farmers to be able to market them. We will then pass on to Michael Homos. Michael will speak about his work at Future Biogas, where he supports farmers to plant and grow the right crops to get the best out of their AD systems. And Jonathan Hodgson will complete the webinar today. He came second in this year's Soil Farmer of the Year competition, and he will speak about his experiences growing flax and hemp. So Josiah, if you want to kick off.
Okay, let me just. Brilliant. Has that all worked? Can you see my screen? Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Megan. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about our business, which is called Hodmedod, which was founded in 2012 to address many of the questions that Megan has spoken about in the introduction, and to really think about what the benefits of diversification might be in terms of climate resilience, in terms of biodiversity recovery, in terms of farm income and the economics of farming, but also in terms of human health as well. So I've got just a few slides which I'm going to talk through, and at the end there are going to be crops and things, which I guess is the exciting bit. But I'm going to give a little bit of context to start with, because I think it's just really important to remind ourselves of all of this. So for 70 odd years, we had what you could broadly call the productivist paradigm. We had this idea that we needed to produce as much food as we could. That food needed to be as affordable as possible. And farmers really, really responded to that policy. And that led to a situation where we've got really, really big fields, particularly in East Anglia, that are producing things like, this is a crop full of oilseed rape. And that really delivered really up until the mid 2000s, and then we began to question whether the externalities, as economists love to call them, of that were really such a great thing for us or for the environment, for human health and for the environment, and whether we needed strategies on farm that mitigated for things like climate change and offered us some sort of adaptive strategies for climate change. So bit more context really over that same 70-year period. This is a slide from a researcher called Phil Howard in North America. He's well worth looking up, and it's all about consolidation in agribusiness. And I think these things are obviously very familiar to farmers, but they're really, really important to keep in mind. The fact that there are now 4 big seed businesses, and those are the red circles, the large red circles, and agrochemical businesses that control 60% of all seed globally. That's really, really significant, and it really limits choice about what we can do on farm, and it actually really limits the strategies that we might adopt in order to bring those adaptive approaches to our farm businesses and to the agri ecosystems that we operate in. So they also control traits, so it's not just the seeds, it's the traits within the seeds, and it's the chemicals that are used and the applications that are used on those seeds. There's lots of positives about all of that, but also there are some real negatives about consolidation and choice and power in the food system. So Hodmedod began as a community project in 2008 when we were really, really concerned about exactly those questions. We were concerned about issues around food security. Could we feed ourselves? And if we did, what were we going to be eating? We asked that question with a community group in Norwich. At that time, we were working as part of an NGO called East Anglia Food Link, and we really looked at land use type, dietary requirements, and what was already being grown in East Anglia. We did some modelling, and we sort of came to the conclusion that a relatively extensive model that included diversity of cropping, some livestock, you could produce a system that was less dependent on inputs, which are expensive, but also have all sorts of problems associated with them. And we could feed ourselves really well on that basis. One of the big questions that emerged from that is we'd need more legumes in the rotation to fix nitrogen. And we'd also need more legumes in the rotation to replace some of the protein that we weren't able to produce from livestock. And that raised the question of whether people in the UK are prepared to eat beans. We started with Norwich, and initially we thought we would be encouraging people to eat the beans that are, as I look at the screen, as I expect you look at the screen on the right-hand side, which are really what we call New World beans, so Phaseolus varieties, common beans, climbing beans, but also things like chickpeas and lentils that aren't historically grown in the UK but are eaten here. Um, and we really quickly realised that those crops are nigh on impossible to grow in the UK, though we have persisted. Um, and that the crops that do grow really well, fava beans, Vicia faba, or peas, we just weren't eating. We got rich during the industrial agricultural revolutions, and those foods have been stigmatized as poor people's food, and they disappeared. And the people in Norwich who ate those peas and beans, I mean, we thought it'd be quite challenging because they're unfamiliar. But the people that we shared all those, and we shared about a ton in the end in half-kilo packets, all across different community groups and different organisations. And we had a really, really positive response. And when we finished working on the project with the Norwich Community Group, we realised there was an opportunity to start an enterprise that would find a route to market for these crops and could work with farmers in order to return a higher value to farm for growing those crops. One of the challenges with particularly pulse crops in the UK is that they're very variable in terms of yield and they're not very well valued by the market. So it's often very difficult to feel confident or happy about planting them. So we began by looking at beans and peas that were being exported or used in commodity human consumption. And we quickly realized we could start to, as the volumes increased, we could start to ask farmers to grow very specific peas and beans. So this is a carlin pea grown on a farm in Shropshire. Carlin peas are a very old-fashioned pea. They fall over a lot. They're often used in green manure mixes or in cover crop mixes, or they can be used as animal feed. And that is the story of most pulse crops in the UK, that they end up being used for animal feed. But it's absolutely delicious. It's the closest thing in the UK we've got to a chickpea that we can grow really well here. And so we began to kind of create markets for the carlin pea. And as we began to create the markets for those crops and recognizing the risks that come, particularly with leguminous crops, we realized that intercropping and bicropping were really good approaches to mitigate some of the risks that come with growing those crops. So this is a field here. And in the foreground, the large yellow flowered sort of mustardy plant is camelina, which is an oil seed. And that's being grown with lentils. And they're the sort of feathery leaves that you can see below the camelina plant. The camelina provides some structural support for the lentils, and the camelina itself is a relatively high value oil seed. So if both of those crops work in a particular year, there's a really good return to farm. But if one of them works well and the other one doesn't work so well, there's still a decent return to farm. So by working out how to do things like that and developing new approaches, we've been able to figure out ways of bringing things to market that are perhaps higher risk agronomically. We've also had a costing model, the return to farm. So we anticipated when we, following our trial period with lentils, that we'd have probably a 1 in 4 year failure on lentils. So we pay a premium that reflects that failed year. So that encourages the farmers we work with to want to grow with us consistently. But it also means that if they don't have that failure year, they're actually getting a really, really good return. That limits that obviously, I mean, we're paying farmers ex farm somewhere in the region of £1,200 most years for lentils. They land cleaned in the UK from Canada or Australia at about £900 a ton, sometimes a bit less. So we're obviously much more expensive, and by the time we've cleaned, they're even more expensive. But it's really, really critical with all of these niche crops and this diversification that you have a route to market that recognizes the value that you're adding on farm and is willing to pay that. If we end up racing towards commodity production, and I think import substitution is something that's always happened with novel crops, a drive to import substitution really, really quickly, is you end up in a race to the bottom very, very quickly, and that doesn't actually offer the economic benefits that we might hope for. So I've got a few more pictures of that intercropping. So so this is what we deal with. This is that same mix, X farm. The lentils are very low growing. I mean, this is particularly bad. This is from one of our trial plots, but I like to show it because it just shows how complicated the X farm and beyond the farm gate element of this is. So the lentil seeds and the camelina seeds, which are the sort of golden colored seeds, are relatively easy to separate because of the size differentials, but it still means multiple passes through cleaning in order to get something that's fit for human consumption. And that sort of trickiness and the infrastructure not really being in place to properly allow for that is something that we've had to overcome over the last 5 or 10 years. More straightforward intercropping. This is barley and peas. That's a very much a known quantity. and this is it a little bit later in the year. And then, some of the agronomic advantages of intercropping and growing with these pulse crops. So on the left-hand side, you've got the oats, well, it's boats essentially, oats growing with the beans, and the oats are doing that thing of suppressing the weeds. The bean yield is lower because they're also slightly suppressed, but without the weed problem, you've got even maturity and they're easier to harvest. On the other side, you can see the beans without the oats, and this is an organic farm on light land, and you can see there's a lot of fat hen and thistle coming in through there that just simply isn't present on the left-hand side. Um, Different approaches. This is a strip approach. We actually now don't think that works brilliantly. It's actually we get more benefits from the bicrop by mixing the species together in the row rather than having them split between rows. And then there are things that we've learned that have been really, really fascinating. So, for example, this is a mustard and pea combination, which works brilliantly in an agronomic sense. It's essentially a larger version of the lentil camelina mixture. But because mustards are an allergen, and this is where the route to market is so important and understanding your customer, there's such a high risk of allergenic oils being present on the peas through the supply chain that we haven't been able to pursue this model because we'd had to put an allergy warning on all our peas. So there's some sort of interesting kind of uh, challenges that don't necessarily reveal themselves on the farm, but do reveal themselves further down the supply chain. And then I've got some sort of wacky stuff which you might be interested in talking about at the end. So this is a lay period on an organic farm as it happens, but it wouldn't have to be organic. And this is caraway. So caraway, plant it in the first year with your lay crop, with your cover crop. And then in the second year it flowers and you can harvest it high by cutting across the top. We haven't fully figured that out yet, but what I would say is it's a really high value crop, and if you haven't got livestock on that part of the rotation, there's a real opportunity to add value by growing something harvestable in a place which would otherwise just be a fertility building. And then this is kind of accidental bicrops, which I thought might be quite interesting. So this looks like a right mess, doesn't it? And that is actually marrowfat peas being grown for us. They are in there. But really, really interestingly, we looked at this and we thought, well, there's a real opportunity here to harvest the poppy seeds and see if we can make something of red poppy seeds. So although there was a massive yield penalty on the marrowfat peas because of the weed burden in here, we actually ended up with a lot of poppy seeds, and the poppy seeds themselves are a very high value crop and didn't actually require much cleaning. And so we've been selling organic red poppy seeds, which have patched the hole in the return to farm on that particular field, which I think is really fascinating, a different perspective, different way of looking at what a weed might be in a field. And then finally, just a picture of what that diversity looks like in practice. Not all of it grown on the same farm, certainly not all of it grown in the same fields, but by encouraging customers to take a risk, offering recipes, and we do that through our website and through our communications, encouraging people to try new foods and finding different routes to market. So, for example, we market the naked oats that you can see there as an alternative to rice, and that's really cutting through, and that's really working. And things like the camelina, which is not a familiar crop in the UK, but actually has a really fantastic flavour. It is a great addition to bakery mixes. So finding markets for those crops that return value to farm has been really, really important. And that's all I'm going to say, really, because I think there's lots of questions there, and I could talk more about costs and things like that, but I think we've got such short time together, so I'm going to unshare. There we go. Has that worked?
Perfect. Yep, perfect. Thank you. And yeah, just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, there's the Q&A function at the bottom. So just sort of put them in as you go, and then we'll have a designated time at the end to run through them all. Michael, if you want to go next.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me share my. Hopefully you can see that. Brilliant. So my name is Michael Jarmers. I work for a company called Future Biogas. We own and operate a number of AD plants, predominantly in the east of England. Slightly novel in the fact that all of our AD plants are entirely crop fed, where now new plants being built are a mixture of crop and waste or predominantly waste. So we're sort of filling that on farm AD, large scale AD void that exists in the market. Um, Similar to Josiah's presentation, sort of looking back, really in terms of what a crop rotation used to look like. So a long, long time ago, none of us will remember it, but the medieval rotation, crop followed by a fallow, and sort of that fallow, the purpose really being as a sort of rest and recharge of the soil. The crop could have been wheat, barley, or maybe even a pulse that Josiah's bringing back to life. But that sort of that fallow period in between really, really sort of valuable for those farmers. Farming in strips, strip farming. So commoners would have a strip and they'd have a crop one year and a fallow the next. So really quite a high proportion of that land potentially fallow at any one time. And then sort of following on from that, the Norfolk four-course rotation sort of really revolutionized the output of farmland, designed to have two crops and two sort of forage crops, so grass and clover being grazed, turnips being harvested and fed to livestock over winter, all grazed in the field. But really sort of upping that productivity of the land from 1 year crop followed by a fallow to an actual rotation rather than just alternation. And then similar to Josiah mentioning, that sort of drive for productivity or on large scale arable farms, potentially focusing more on wheat, oilseed rape, sugar beet in the east of England, but sort of a reduction in crop diversity, probably driven by fewer grazing livestock in the areas in the east of England. But that's led to, pest, weed, and disease complications, huge proliferation of grass weeds, the green crops sort of leading to that disease carryover. And over time, a reduction in soil organic matter, and, everything that brings with it. So the challenge is, as I see it today, there's a whole host of break crops, and they're an essential part of any modern rotation, but they can be challenging to grow for a number of reasons. That could be agronomic, lack of chemistry or lack of effective chemistry, not providing a true break in the case of some cereals and take-all, for example, in wheat, and proliferation of pests, whether they be, insect pests, diseases, or weeds. Could be economic challenges, the price, market demand, or lack of for some of these break crops. Risk not necessarily being worth the reward with some of these crops. And then through to practical considerations, machinery, workload, soil type, how do these break crops actually fit into the workload of a modern farm? Machinery, depreciation, sort of trying to extend the harvesting season can have a practical sort of consideration with regards to the weather and things like that. So an opportunity, as I'm sort of here to talk about today, I see energy crops as a big opportunity for farmers across the country. They can provide arable farmers with a chance to diversify rotation, workload, and income stream, and also bring that organic manure element that a lot of farms have lost over the past sort of 40, 50 years. Same sort of titles across that table. Agronomic, some of these crops offer cultural controls, being spring planted or planted at a different time of year. Alternative chemistry to control different weeds, for example, and diversity in the rotation. Economics, price, there's potential to fix price for a long term. Energy crops offer sort of certain market demand on tonnage or area commitments. Diversifying the farm income, really sort of de-risking from the commodity markets, sort of being able to specialize in different areas. Practical, machinery, as an example, we employ contractors to harvest all of the crops for us. So from a machinery point of view, if you're growing 15-20% of your area as an energy crop for us, you could think about keeping your combine harvester for 20% longer. Opportunity to spread the workload or potentially expand the farming business without sort of needing more staff on farm. And we present opportunities across all soil types. Couple of crops we work with. We work across sort of a number of crops, but I'm going to focus on maize and rye as our sort of biggest feedstock components. So maize, for those who aren't familiar with growing it, It's spring planted, allowing for cultural control of grass weeds, blackgrass in particular, but we're seeing a whole host of other interesting grass weeds, ryegrass and bromes, etc., becoming more prolific. There's alternative chemistry available in maize that isn't available for use in cereal crops, so really good opportunity to sort of break that resistance cycle. Lower disease pressure in the following cereal. In some cases, I spoke about take-all, but growers should be mindful of fusarium if they've got milling wheat in a rotation. Maize has got a different rooting system, so that can really help benefit soil structure. Where growers are predominantly growing just cereal crops, having sort of a big root ball as maize grows can be really beneficial to soil structure. Reduced nitrogen requirements compared to cereals, good on a number of points really. Either you're looking to reduce your carbon footprint, reduce spend on inputs, but yeah, a maximum of 150 kilos of nitrogen, a lot less than some other crops. Opportunity for cover crops, strip tillage, inter-row sowing or hoeing, and that's something we don't see with all sorts of mainstream crops. See the picture in the middle at the bottom is some land that we have down near Doncaster. Our operation down there, under sowing of those maize crops with grass, has allowed a first generation shepherd to come and graze his sheep every winter and bring livestock back onto that farm, which hasn't had it for many years now. Tips for success: choosing the right variety of maize is really important. Doing your homework, looking at the independent variety data available from NIAB. Don't just be sold a really high yielding variety because you might never get to harvest it in time. Cultivation and drilling date. Starting drilling in the third week of April can be a really challenging time to create a seedbed. Things are drying out by then, and so we see growers sort of planting everything else in February through to March. The maize comes last, obviously, but it can be really challenging to make a decent seedbed. So giving that adequate thought is really one tip for success. Harvest timing, maize has some great benefits, but it can also be high risk for soil erosion and runoff if it's not managed correctly. So timing of harvest, ensuring that you're getting that balance right between timeliness of operation and also maturity of the crop, and not leaving it too late into the winter when weather can really be against you. Contract terms, whether you're growing maize for AD, for grain, for forage, for dairy or beef farmers, it's generally traded quite differently to other commodity products. So definitely sort of getting your head around those contract terms. You're being paid on fresh weight, dry matter weight, an adjusted tonnage based on dry matter, but really sort of getting your head around that and sort of understanding what you're signing up to. Rye is another important crop for us. It's more drought tolerant than other cereals, so really fits into that sort of light land rotation where growers perhaps don't want to grow maize for a variety of reasons, but it's sort of can really replace that maybe spring barley crop that's never quite yielded enough to pay for itself. Rye has a reduced fungicide spend compared to other cereals, a lower nitrogen demand. It's earlier to harvest because we're taking it as a whole crop cereal. So harvested in sort of late June, early July. If growers are still trying to grow oilseed rape, it's a really good early entry into that. It has a low take-all carryover. It's not a true break like oats would be, so it's something to be aware of. But still a really good alternative to second wheat. Tips for success: early planting is essential. Although hybrid rye is sort of sold as having sort of huge hybrid vigor, it does, but generally in the spring rather than the autumn. So we'd see rye being planted from sort of early September onwards, and that's really essential to get that early tillering. Monitor for slugs. It seems more susceptible or tastier to slugs than other winter cereals. Early nitrogen, as with hybrid barley, hybrid rye really needs and benefits from that sort of early first dose of nitrogen. Harvest timing for grass weed control. We see a lot of growers growing whole crop cereals to remove those grass weeds from the field. And getting the timing right in terms of balancing the crop maturity and harvesting early enough to remove those weed seeds is something sort of really important for success if that's why you're growing the crop. And a big consideration as more and more hybrid rye is being grown is ergot in the following cereals. Rye is quite susceptible to ergot, and it can also lead to a sort of higher risk in following cereals. So definitely something to watch out for. We see energy crops as sort of fundamental, a key part of crop rotations going forward, allowing that diversity in a rotation, and also receiving digestate back on farm and sort of filling that void of organic manure that perhaps hasn't been returned for quite some time. Improving overall soil fertility, protecting the topsoil through the use of catch and cover crops or undersowing of grass, increasing soil carbon, having a break for those pests and diseases that otherwise sort of proliferate through quite tight cereal-based rotations, maximizing overall crop yields. Seeing a benefit from that diversity of rotation is something I think all of our growers do, seeing better first wheat yields again instead of sort of really tight wheat rotations, and that opportunity to diversify the income away from straight commodity markets that we might otherwise be used to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. And Jonathan, do you want to start?
Yep, I can. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me on here today. Basically, I will just give you a brief history of us and then go on to why we are doing what we're doing. We are a 280 hectare farm in East Yorkshire, east of Hull. Most of you probably won't have visited there because you don't unless you have a particular purpose to go there. So we're right at the pointy bit of East Yorkshire. The North Sea is only 3 miles away. So 280 hectare farm. We predominantly arable, but more towards mixed farming these days. Up to 2019, probably very conventional in terms of our approach and our mindset. Beyond that, we have obviously changed the way we farm. To start with, we sold our cultivation equipment and bought a strip till drill. Soon after that, we found that I went down a bit of a rabbit hole of looking at soil health, and everything that's obviously sort of, spoke about quite a lot these days. So yeah, we diversified the rotation. We've changed how we manage the soil, look after the crops in terms of just doing things differently. You can call it regenerative, whatever it wants to be called. It's just a different way of looking at how we farm and try and basically look after the soils better and get a best margin possibly can for our crops we produce, and cutting away the things that are unnecessary, we feel, and probably harmful at times. So we now have a very diverse rotation on the farm. Everything's sort of focused around the first wheat scenario because that's what can generate the most cash generally. We grow wheats, we grow spring oats, we grow winter beans. We're growing again, obviously, right this time. We grow, what else we got in the ground? We've got some obviously the flax and the hemp and herbal layers in the rotation. So that's us in a concise nutshell. I'll try and keep it brief because I know time is the essence. So if I just share my screen, I'll get into the crops that obviously has brought me here. So if I get on to, so everyone can see that. I've just done something very basic to show you the flax and the hemp that we're growing. We've been growing flax for 4 years now, and it came about with a conversation from Nick, who runs and owns East Yorkshire Hemp. They're a hemp grower and processor just 10 miles north from us. And he was looking for flax growers to provide the fibre for Harrison and Spinks, who are the farmers near Doncaster, but they also own a mattress manufacturing company in Sheffield. So they were looking to replace cotton with alternative fibres. So I think I got this right. Basically, a mixture of flax fibre, wool, and hemp into some of their mattresses to make them, so they have less impacts on the environment. that's where we started. So we started 4 years ago with 10 hectares, and it was, I'll be honest, it was a bit of a disaster, really. With a cover crop, I turned some ewes out in the cover crop, and they really damaged the soil structure on the surface. And then I went in with a drill, and the soils are still changing at that time. 4 years ago, they are very different these days. But then straight with the strip till drill, and seed rate wasn't enough, and then it didn't rain, and then we had flax flea beetle really hammering it. So we only managed to achieve just over a ton a hectare of fibre, which is nowhere near enough to cover costs and make a bit of money. But we decided to persevere with it because we felt there was, it was unfair to give a crop a 1 year trial. So we went back and put another 10 hectares in the next spring, and that worked far better. There was no pest problems. We achieved 5.5 ton a hectare. So that spurred us on. So, and then after the year after that, we grew. We worked with Elsons to grow a seed crop for them. So they wanted the seed, we could have the fibre, and that worked really well. So that was interesting to get the seed off and then get the fibre. So it was two bites of cherry, you say. And this year just gone, we were working with a chap from France who was wanting to bring long fibre production into the UK again. So we worked with him. Sadly, our fibre wasn't long enough to be long fibre because of the dry weather. So we went back to something we did the previous year. I hired a stripper header. We stripped the bulbs off, and then this year we actually used a grass mower, and we mowed it and baled. So that's where we're at with the flax. Just to put some figures into context for people who are watching and want to know about it, there isn't a lot of agronomy wise, very little really, because there's very little approved for flax in terms of agronomy. So you sort of use off labels and emus and things like that. So you use the glyphosate, and then obviously there is a pre-emergent herbicide, and you can use post-emergent herbicides, but you've got to be careful with products like sulfonyl ureas because they can stunt the growth of the flax, which then obviously you want the height of the flax to get the yield. So little things like that. Very little fertilizer. We don't use P&K. We haven't done for 6-7 years, so we only apply a little bit of nitrogen, 40 to 60 kilos. That's all it needs. But the biggest problem, or the biggest cost, sorry, I should say, is what we've got is the seed cost. Flaxseed there's no, although we did with Elsons the previous year, there's very little or no UK seed production, so it all comes from the continent, and it's just over £3 a kilo. So when you're putting 120 kilos, it's just really it eats into your gross margin. That's the biggest problem with both crops actually, is the cost of the seed. So yeah, that sort of eats into that. So in terms of yield, for a crop to sort of compete, I mean, when oyster rape is good, there's anything out there to struggle to compete with oyster rape. So it's never gonna, at these current prices, it's never going to compete with something like an oyster rape crop when you get a reasonable crop off that. But you need 5 to 6 ton a hectare really the time to get to that sort of income figure. But after then you've got mowing and tedding and baling and leading and storing, etc. So it really does eat into that cost there. So that's the biggest drawback we find with the flax, is the seed cost. We have saved some seed ourselves this year because we stripped it off. So next spring it will bring that cost down. So that's something you cannot do with hemp, but potentially you could do with flax. Just points of interest for the flax. It's the markets for the fibre and the seed. The markets, as I've explained, limited. We can obviously I sell mine to East Yorkshire Hemp, and then they sell it on either to Harrison Spinks, or potentially it can go abroad. There are emerging markets, but I've been hearing these emerging markets for 3-4 years, and we're still in the emerging market stage, so which is really frustrating because it's a good product. The seed we stripped with the strip header this year. That we got a good price for that. That was £580 a ton, which went to a company to make it to horse feed. But sadly, there wasn't enough. This year's crop just struggled because of the weather. So it's nice to have 2 bites of the cherry, but we still need other factors in our favour to generate a reasonable yield. Just on that point, if you're growing for fibre, you reduce the seed rate. No, sorry, to the ground. To get the fibre, increase the seed rate because then there's competition and that drives height of the flax. If you want seed, then you reduce the seed rate and produce more bulbs. So I'm still trying to sort of work out seed rates to try and get both and get a reasonable gross margin. You get a cracking first week after flax like you do with linseed. It's just a really good plant to be in your soil. I use it in my cover crops. It's just brilliant. And you get a really good soil. It's just conditioned soil and it's good for, it's really good for the soil. Well, the weather's like for any crop, I suppose, but springtime with a small seed, you do need the weather to be in your favour ever so slightly, because that's what struggled for a couple of seasons with this. It's just the lack of moisture. Even if we don't plough, we drill straight into moisture that's there. You still do the weather with you. Flax flea beetle has been an issue. Someone might be telling me if there's a difference between the flax flea beetle and the flea beetle, but it comes from somewhere and can be a problem. We do apply fish hydrolysate, which seems to help a little bit. Specialist equipment may not be necessary, but we have used a flax puller in the past. And before I finish this, I'll show you a video on a flax puller. It's quite a funky little bit of kit. Seeds expensive, I've mentioned that. At the moment, there's no commercial long fibre industry in the UK. We've been producing short fibres, which generate less income per ton because you're not keeping the fibre in its entire length. We can ted it out with a tedder and bale it with a conventional baler. That is in terms of being like a large Hessian baler. But long fibres generate far more in terms of cash. But you need the infrastructure, and we've lost that in the UK after synthetics took over. Any long fibre that's produced in the UK, we use a little bit, that all gets exported to the continent. And just 2 bites of the cherries, like I said before, if we can extract the seed off with a stripper header and then either pull or mow the fibres, we've got 2 crops, which I think is really interesting. Quickly moving on to hemp. Well, hemp's the first year we've grown it this year. Again, we're growing it for East Yorkshire Hemp. So it's early days for us on that one. I can't come to any financial conclusions yet because this year we only achieved about 2.5 ton hectare, so clearly not enough to really make a reasonable crop per hectare. But again, sprays very little, fertiliser a little bit more. Seed price, it's £6 a kilo roughly. You're putting 40 kilos a hectare on. It's that's it's Achilles heel again for a crop. But very little prospect of saving your own seed on that one, I think. So again, you need between 5 and 6, 7 ton a hectare really to get a good crop. This year was just again hampered by dry weather, but I'm amazed we've got 2.5 ton of crop. 2.5 ton hectare crop, to be honest, considering how dry and very little rain we got. When it grows, it just does grow like daily. And points of interest for the crop again, like the flax, excellent first week. I think someone told me the hemp pumps the most amount of carbon into the soil. Good root structure, so get a really good first week. Obviously, you need a license to grow hemp from the Home Office. Those rules have changed, so it's a lot easier to get a license these days. You can put almost your entire farm down. It has changed, but it does take a little bit of time. But once you've got it for 5 years, I believe. So it is a lot easier than it used to be. Markets, again, a little bit restrictive. I think there's maybe a bit more market for hemp, but there's only a couple of processors, I believe, in the UK. There's one, obviously, East Yorkshire Hemp, and I think there's one up in the Scottish Borders that process it into horse bedding, composite panels, roofing materials, anything like that. It's market for hemp is, it's got lots of uses. The one thing that makes me nervous is, obviously, we cut the hemp into the specialist cutter in early August, but he needs to rep for both crops. Need to rep, by the way. Sorry, I didn't explain this. So when you're either pulling the hemp or pulling the flax or cutting the hemp, you need to leave it on the ground for 6 or 8 weeks to ret, which is in terms of just sort of it needs a bit of a rain on it. So either just rain onto the flax, or the hemp needs soil to crop contact to break the shiv down on the outsides of the plant. And that needs a specialist cutter. And again, I explained, the seed is expensive. I see it's already gone 22, so I don't want to keep it too much time, but I will just stop sharing this, and I'll bob you a couple of videos up.
If maybe you want to pick the main video, watch that quickly, and then if anyone's got specific interest, we can maybe share the other videos later, and then so we can still have plenty of time for Q&A. If anyone has any questions after the 3 talks, start adding them in now, and after the video, we'll move on to question and answer.
There we go. Right. Let me just share this one. So this is a flax puller. Hang on. So this is a flax puller. It looks a bit, not very modern, but basically it's pulling the fibre out of the ground so you get the entire length. So that's a flax puller. We've used that a couple of times in the past. But Harry was dead keen on doing that, but he got a bit bored after half of the day because the novelty soon wore off. But anyhow, there's a flax puller for you, and I will. There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we've got one question to start us off, and I think it came in when you were speaking, Michael. And so the question is: could the use of a 60 kilo electric drone help to establish different intercrops at different times with the maize? Would that support better yields from both? I think from both the main crop and the crop planted by the drone.
So we've tried various ways of establishing cover crops and inter-row sowing. I think for maize specifically, quite important to keep the companion that you're planting, or the inter-row species that you're planting, sort of a minimum of 10-15 centimeters away from the rows. Otherwise you get, although maize is quite an impressive plant, it's actually really susceptible to weed competition. So sort of that broadcasting approach doesn't give you that space. And also getting that seed soil contact is something we found is really, really important with the cover crops or inter-row sowing. We spread cover crops on, like broadcast them on with a fert spreader, with slug pelleter. We've applied it with digestate into the crop, and they all none of them do as good as planting it with a coulter, is our experience. So possibly it would certainly help. The biggest restriction in using a inter-row drill is you can only plant up to sort of 6 to 8 leaf of the maize, and then it's too tall to do anything else with. So potential use for a drone sort of planting later on. But then by the time it's sort of too late to use your inter-row sowing machine, your maize canopy is closed up anyway. So by spreading seeds with the drone, how many seeds are actually going to make it to the soil versus just be caught in the canopy of the maize? So possibly, I'm not sure. But there are plenty of trials going on with drones, and sort of looking at those, with some farmers and some water companies as well, having a look. So keep having a look.
Yeah, definitely want to keep an eye on, see what comes out of the space. Just had another one in. So the question is, I don't know if it's anyone specific. James, if you want to add, if it's anyone specific, please do, or anyone who wants to take it can. And and it says, will additional fertilizer inputs be required beyond the use of digestate? So I assume that's maybe to you, Michael, of if you're casting the seed.
Yeah, so P and K, no, generally not. But nitrogen, yes, would be required in addition to what's in the digestate generally, depending on nutrient indices and all the rest of it. But generally, P and K was self-sufficient with a small amount of nitrogen required to sort of bring us up to a sensible rate.
Perfect, thank you. I'll ask a couple of questions while we see if anyone else wants to put any in. So I had a question for Josiah after you were mentioning about the marketing of the poppy seeds in the crop, was it a pea crop with a lot of poppy seeds in. And I remember at the time, or I don't know if it was that time or I remember in the Hodmedod's email newsletter before, there was sort of a piece on we're starting to market these poppy seeds and this is why, and it's sort of supporting the farms financially. How do you find at Hodmedod's that communication with customers? How important do you find that is? How time consuming do you find it? But do you think it's a worthwhile use of time?
Yeah, I mean, it's our main job really, is communicating what's happening on farms and encouraging people to support those and buy those. And I think, we're a middle person, and obviously that's quite a demonized role in the food system, and it has a tendency to be extractive and exploitative. But I think middle people have a potentially really important kind of enabling role, taking some of that post-harvest communication work, for example, in particular, identifying what those routes to market are. I mean, the farmer in question, and we've done this through a couple of farms now, would never have thought to find a route to market for those poppy seeds and would have really, really struggled to do that. So yeah, I think it's critical to what we do. It's really, really important. And I think also sometimes we're testing the ground for things that are happening on a really small scale. I mean, literally 1.5, 2 tons of poppy seeds at a time coming off farms. So it's not massive quantities, but it's sort of proof of concept stuff, and other people might pick up bits of those ideas and do other things with them. And I think that's really important. And by just demonstrating that there is a potential market and a potential route to market, we can start to open up conversations about other crops and other opportunities.
Thank you. And then a question for all of you, Jonathan. I don't know if you want to start with it. What were any sort of initial worries you had when you sort of started thinking about diversifying your crop rotation? And did those worries ever come true? And if so, how did you deal with them? Or sort of looking back, were those worries as much of a concern as you thought they might be?
Sorry, Megan, is that for me?
Oh yes, yeah. If you want to start, Jonathan, and then
Sorry.
Josiah and Michael, if you want to feed in as well.
Just quickly say that again. Sorry.
Before you started sort of diversifying your rotation, what were the main worries you had? And did those worries sort of come true? And yeah, looking back, how was your experience of those concerns you had?
Concerns about expanding the rotation. I think we used to grow linseed years ago, so I had a bit of experience with linseed, not flax, but so we kind of knew the benefits of growing linseed in the rotation, but I never fully understood why. I do now, as I explained earlier. But to go to anything like crops like the flax and the hemp probably wouldn't have even entered my head pre-2019 because I don't know. I wouldn't have had that right mindset to really look outside the box. And probably at the time, you had no problems growing oilseed rape. It was fine. We had other chemistry that kept bugs at bay. So it probably wouldn't have entered my head, and I really wouldn't have thought. I wouldn't have thought twice about growing it. Really, I don't think, unless I'd followed the herd probably if everybody else was doing it. Now, very different mindset. You look at things very differently, and you do your own thing, not worry about what your neighbours are thinking. That makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael or Josiah. Do you have anything you want to feed in?
Yeah, I think growing some alternative crops. In my case now, more focused on energy crops. It is it is that sort of mindset change. So, when we're growing a forage rye crop, we don't need it to be totally weed free. We're taking we're taking the whole crop. It's sort of, having that sort of acceptable level of weeds in it that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think, that's one part of it. The other is sort of, where over the past sort of 20-30 years, cereals, we're putting growth regulators on to stop them falling over, to shorten the straw. We want the grain, not the straw. We want to sort of modify the growth of the plant to really put as much effort into grain production. We want a little bit of that with hybrid rye and barley, but actually we want these tall varieties that produce huge amounts of biomass. So that can be, a bit of a mindset shift. But in terms of sort of biggest sort of dramas when it comes to sort of alternative crops, I think it's people getting good advice, trying things on a small scale, finding out what works for them. We've got growers in the same region growing totally different varieties, because for some of the growers, they want that entry into a first wheat after maize. They need to be growing an early variety, and just trying, finding what works for them in their system. And I think that's sort of, baby steps, isn't it? But trying a small area first and having a go.
Thanks. And Josiah?
I'd echo a lot of that, actually. I think, everyone's looking for an answer to a problem that may be occurring in their rotation. And we often get calls from people, saying, I've got a 100-acre block this year. What can I put in it? And it's sort of not lentils. And it's kind of like the conversation, if we are sharing risk, which we do, we supply seed usually, and the way that works is that we'd say, how much can you afford to lose? This crop is not guaranteed. If you're starting out growing it, you've got to figure out the agronomy for your own farm, and just be really aware of what those risks are. And I think that's a really healthy conversation to have, because it's so easy to oversupply or take too much risk on a crop, that these niche crops are inherently risky.
Thank you. And a question has popped up. I think it's for you, Jonathan. It's a little bit sort of off the farm, but if you can answer it, that would be amazing. But so the question is, how can researchers buy small quantities of hemp fibre from farm or for lab research? Do you know if that is restricted by a need for licensing to buy a small quantity of hemp fibre?
Guessing slightly, but to purchase hemp fibre, I couldn't see it being a problem. I would probably best direct you to Nick at East Yorkshire Hemp. I mean, I can pass on the details later, because he's the guy who buys it off me and processes it, and then it goes on to whoever. He will know the answer to that one, or the British Hemp Association probably know the answer to that one. But in terms of buying it, I can't see on the outset it being a problem. But I don't fully know, but I know Nick would definitely. He'd know the answer, but I can get his details if that is required.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, and if anyone wants to get in touch with me on that one, and we could maybe link up contact details, me or Tash, I think there should be some contact details on the Raise website, and we can link that up. So to prevent us running over, I think, unless anyone wants to put in a last 30-second question, I'll wrap up. So firstly, thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you to all of our speakers. It's been really interesting to hear both the everyday opportunities, the agronomic challenges, and everything in between, from growing, from diversifying your rotation and growing different crops. And I think that maybe one of the last points that you were making, Josiah, we sort of started this webinar based on the fact that it was about increasing resilience and increasing overall business resilience, but that's not to say it's not without risks, especially in the short term. So there's definitely lots of opportunities out there, and as a lot of things seem to come back to at the moment, coming back to what's right for your farm, your rotation, your context, and making diverse crops work for you. So thank you very much for joining us, and keep an eye on the Raise website. We will have more of these Farm of the Future webinars coming up in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you.